Welcome to Philosopher Rock, where two guys have rock in their heads. In this episode, we will be discussing founding member of Fleetwood Mac, Peter Greeny. Sadly, Peter passed away this year, and we thought we would have a brief look at this legendary guitarist's life. We will discuss his life, his time in Germany with Commune 1, his guitar, which is a story in itself, and we will discuss the use of drugs and mental illness. To help us with this episode, we are joined by Cliff Garner, a fellow muso and authority on the historical era upon which our episode is based. So, let's now join Brian, GK, and special guest Cliff as they discuss the life and times of Peter Greeny.
So here we are again on Philosopher Rock. This is episode 7. It's episode 7, isn't it, Brian?
Yeah.
Okay, so episode 7, and I'm your host, GK. On the line with me from Cincinnati, Ohio, we've got Brian. Good morning, Brian.
Good evening, Garth. How you doing?
I'm doing good, thank you.
I was going to say, we got a special guest with us, Cliff Garner, today. Coming all the way from Chicago. Is it Chicago, Cliff?
No, Springfield, Illinois.
Okay, Illinois.
Yeah, Lincoln's home.
Okay, cool. So, yes, this is the first time we're having a guest on the Philosopher Rock show. Now, on this episode, we're going to be talking about Peter Greeny of Fleetwood Mac. And so we touched ever so briefly on Fleetwood Mac here, and just understand we're going to be talking about the Peter Greeny mainly is who we're going to be focusing on. And if you haven't heard about him before, and, I understand a lot of people may not have, then perhaps you'll learn some things. And conversely, if you know a lot about him, I'm going to ask you to be a bit forgiving of us, as we'll be on a bit of a learning curve here as well. Now, as far as Fleetwood Mac goes, I like to, in my personal opinion, break them down because they've been, over 50 years history of Fleetwood Mac, and so many different members of the band. In my mind, I break them down to 4 separate eras, right? I break them down to the Peter Greeny era. That's the first era, say, 67 to 70, somewhere around there. And then I have the Bob Welch era, where they got the new singer Bob Welch, guitarist. He came in for a couple of years and a few good albums. And then we have the era that most people will know about, and that'll be the Stevie Nicks, Lindsey Buckingham era. That one has been, where they had their biggest commercial success that everyone will know about. And if you don't know about them, maybe you're a bit too young. And then you have this, what I term, in my personal opinion, this latest era where they've sadly, in my opinion, Lindsey Buckingham has left the group, and they've replaced him with a couple of guitarists and another singer. One of those is a well-known New Zealand artist called Neil Finn. Now, Neil Finn, when I lived in New Zealand, I lived in a town one over from Neil Finn, and I used to visit where him and his brothers grew up a fair bit. And now Neil Finn and his brother were in a super huge successful Kiwi band called Split Enz. And then, of course, after that, he was in Crowded House. But the thing about Split Enz, I'll never forget Split Enz, because Split Enz is the only band that I've walked out twice on. I've only ever walked out of one band in 2 separate countries twice. So I walked out of Split Enz concert in New Zealand, and I walked out of a Split Enz concert in Australia, because I just can't stand them live. And that's just my comment, and that's just my opinion. Now, Crowded House was a far better band, okay, in my opinion, but I have never left any band, walked out of any bands twice in 2 different countries. So there you go. That's my point about Split Enz. But that's no reflection on Neil Finn himself, okay? I'm just saying it's just one of those things that I will never forget. Now, as I said, we want to talk about Peter Green. I'm just going to talk super briefly here. He's born Peter Greenbaum in 1946 at Bethnal Green in London, which along with Muswell Hill, the home suburbs of the Kinks, is a well-known Jewish suburb of London. And Peter Green was a founding member of Fleetwood Mac, and as such was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1998. And he has been called one of the greatest guitarists of all time. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. We're talking about style there. We're going to talk to Brian about that in a second, because he knows a bit more about that than I do. But before he was in Fleetwood Mac, he was in, for a brief time, I think one album, John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Now, the Blues Breakers, itself was a band that had so many people pass through it, so many brilliant musos. You've got John McVie, who actually ended up in Fleetwood Mac. You've got Eric Clapton, you've got Jack Bruce, you've got Mick Fleetwood. No need to say any more about Mick Fleetwood. Mick Taylor. You've got Andy Fraser, who came to fame in Free, but at the age of 15 was in John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Brilliant bass player. Love to talk more about that, but that's for another time. But there were so many musos in Mayall's Blues Breakers that a few of those guys moved on into Fleetwood Mac, and that very first version of Fleetwood Mac, it had to be a success, It had to be a brilliant success, in my opinion. Anyway, when they kicked off, Pete Green wrote a number of songs that were charting singles in the time. If you're young, you probably won't know them, but there was Albatross, a favourite of mine. Black Magic Woman, which is a song that Santana later had a huge hit with. There was a song called Man of the World, and one that we're going to focus on here a bit later, the Green Manalishi with a two-pronged crown. We're going to be discussing that shortly. That was later covered by Judas Priest. And something here that Cliff's going to talk about later, Peter Green finished up with Fleetwood Mac around about 1970 after a meeting with Uschi Obermeier and Rainer Langhams of Commune 1 in Germany. But I'm going to let Cliff get into that a bit later, but it's a very important topic that I think we need to talk about, this Commune 1 or Commune 1. Anyway, so I think we'll leave that very brief, and I know it's a very brief intro to the show, very brief intro to Pete Green, but we have so much more meat coming in this that I had to make that brief so that I can get to Brian and our guest a little bit later there, Cliff. So, Brian, can you give us a bit of an overview, ever so brief, Brian, on the musical style of Pete Green?
Yeah. So, basically, Pete Green was a traditional blues type player. When I say traditional blues, it was akin to the Delta blues, like, a la American players like Howlin' Wolf, Robert Johnson, John Lee Hooker. His sound gradually evolved into a more melodic and emotive, like really almost even like a dark, trancey, psychedelic style. Then that was kind of like I would call almost like the one phase of his style. But then by their third album, the Fleetwood Mac album, which is Then Play On, he was exploring more of almost like an atmospheric and kind of an original direction that, like, it departed to some degree. It departed from like the traditional cookie cutter blues for some more like intricate textures, and including some like Latin and shuffle type styles. As well as by the fourth studio album by Fleetwood Mac, he was incorporating even almost a little bit of like country flavors, something that might even be reminiscent of like what the Grateful Dead was doing at the time. So he was kind of a very complex player. He wasn't really what some people would consider a shredder or anything like that. His even depending on what style he was doing, and regardless of what he was doing, he was a little different than most of the people that came from the same group that he came from. He wasn't flashy in a sense, in a normal sense. Not so much of an out front guitar player that kind of like a guitar hero type of guy like Jimmy Page or Eric Clapton or anything like that. I think he's more concerned with the feeling versus the showmanship, so to speak. But he did achieve a cult status for multiple reasons. And I think we can turn it over to Cliff now to maybe talk about some of the reasons that he became like a cult, achieved a cult status or whatever, because it's not all not all of it had to do with exactly his playing style. So, Cliff, turn it over to you to maybe talk to us about Peter Green, the man, versus Peter Green, the musician.
Right, the legend, right? One of the things that people here in the States don't really appreciate about who he was that he was really rivaling what Jimmy Page was doing with Led Zeppelin at the time, and in Europe he was huge. I mean, just totally huge. And one of the things about the Dead Angle, he met up with Owsley, the acid maker, in what I think it was '68 when they did tour of the U.S. Yeah, it was '68 or '9, and that's when he started doing the acid, and he really got into it. So there was that, but he was also listening to Garcia, and they were talking, about improvisation and how the spontaneous creation, was real important, and there was a spiritual quality that would come out through that, and he was influenced by that whole thinking at the time. Oh, and the same with the blues too. I mean, he picked up on the old blues guys, Elmore James and Robert Johnson and B.B. King, and B.B. King himself probably gave him the best compliment I ever saw about him, where he said that he gave him the chills just to listen to him play. That the other rock guitar players, they didn't care so much, but with him, he was special. He'd get a lot of emotion out of one note, and that's one of the things I liked about it. His playing. The one album I had was the Chicago album, and they sat in with oh goodness, it was Buddy Guy, and Otis Spann played piano on it. He was dying at the time. I don't know if he did any recordings after that or not. And there were a few others that came in too. These were some of the greats, and they sat in with them the Chicago sessions, and those are really exceptional songs on that album. It's a really good one. But that was also a real pivotal kind of event, apparently, for at least Danny Kerwin. I guess he felt kind of guilty about stealing black music at the time. But he was a rival to, like I say, they were a rival to Led Zeppelin in Europe. They didn't quite hit over here quite as hard. They for some reason just didn't translate as well as Zeppelin did. Zeppelin really struck some kind of a chord. Maybe it was the aggression.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, but there was some aggression in their music too. If you listen to Oh Well, part one, that'll knock your socks off.
That happens to be my favorite one from that era too, by the way.
Yeah, well, I liked it a lot. I had a roommate that he used to he liked the second verse really well, and he would turn it into a railing against God, and he would get a little lit up at night, and he'd start singing it. It was really crazy.
Just quickly on the topic of the song "Oh Well," particularly the lyrics, it's interesting because Green says, just after sort of cutting himself down and having a low self-opinion of himself, he says, "When I talked to God, I knew He'd understand. He said, 'Stick by me and I'll be your guiding hand, but don't ask me what I think of you. I might not give you the answer that you want me to.'" And it is true that God does have something to say about us that's not particularly appealing, that we are in a broken, sinful state, fallen and broken and guilty before God. So, of course, we would want to say, as the Bible says, that He has provided a way for us to be sanctified through Jesus, what Jesus did on the cross. The life that He lived was sinless and a substitute for us if we just are willing to basically just humble ourselves and ask for forgiveness. It's there for us.
But Green was the Green God, and that's really where that whole cult status comes from. He was an exceptional player, but he had Clapton and he had Hendrix, who was in his own universe, and then you had him.
Mm-hmm.
And Jimmy Page was in there too, but the thing is he was the guy that replaced Clapton in the Blues Breakers, and people here in the States really never caught on to them either. But they had this band, wonderful blues and jazz. He did a lot of jazz as well. Mel did.
Yeah.
But they were huge at the time. They were hit makers.
Right.
And he had a couple hits. I think it was Albatross that he did with them. That was such a big hit, and it just that really put him across as like at Clapton's level, because he was the suitable replacement for Clapton. They made fun of him at first, but then after he played a little bit, they heard that Albatross. It was like a totally different world. They were like, wow, this guy is great.
Yeah.
So that changed their minds about him, and he became, like I say, the Green God. Eric Clapton was God, right? Did you ever hear that? I'm not sure if you're as old as I am, but people my age, we heard that a lot, and everybody would say that, and it was like, personally, I like the Zeppelin better, but
Yeah, me too. I mean, I do like Clapton for sure, but yeah, but they're two different.
Stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much like anything he's done, but I mean, they were two different. It's kind of funny because they all, Clapton and Page and Beck all really kind of came up in the same ranks anyway through through the Yardbirds and everything else. So yeah, these guys were already hit makers and notable players, early on. But I mean, it's like, as far as Green was concerned, he just had such a different style. I mean, like just a more laid back kind of thing was in general.
His big influence was B.B. King. From what a lot of people I've read, were saying. And he did have that kind of he didn't have to play fast. It's just like you pointed out, it wasn't the speed, because Johnny Winter, I mean, you want to talk about fast guitar players, he was fast. And he was really good. No, not taking anything away from Johnny Winter. I love Johnny Winter. But with Green, it was just like B.B. King. He could get more out of one note than Johnny Winter could out of a whole slew of notes on certain songs.
Right.
Some songs Johnny Winter was in his own element too, but that was just the way of it. He could get a lot out of one, and that takes some doing. You have to feel the song.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you had mentioned that he had some contact with the guys from the West Coast, like say, like the California scene, especially as it is related to LSD. And I know that there was and you mentioned this popularity in Europe, which didn't really quite happen here in the U.S. But what can you tell us a little bit about, like, the whole his whole influence and his whole status, especially as far as like kind of like the cult status that he had in Europe, like relating to like Germany, and I know Germany was like.
Well, Germany. When we talk about the commune stuff, you have to figure Germany was defeated in World War II, and a lot of the people that ran the country were old Nazis.
Yeah.
It's impossible to get rid of them all. And so when the 60s rolled around and all the revolution was in the air, like it was here and like it was everywhere,
right.
in the communist countries too. The rebellion that was coming out had a certain element of shame, I think you would say. So when we look at Germany and what was going on there. It's a different world than here in the West, the further West, I should say, could think about, because there were really strange, complicating factors going on in that. There was a lot of people whose families were actually from Poland and from other areas in the Central and Eastern Asia, Europe, that were forced out at the end of the war, and they ended up going to East or West Germany. There was a huge number that came out of like Romania, and they were chased out, and whole villages of people moved, and they became kind of repatriated, and so you had some really weird counterculture, well, not counter, but cross-cultural kind of issues over there. Now with Green, that was the music of the victors. Okay, so with Germany, you had a style of music that was more folkish, I suppose, in a certain sense. Folkish, as we would tend to think, and it was traditional kind of oompa kind of stuff. And if you go through the Balkans, you hear a lot of that too, because that traditional sound was even in Turkey when I was living there. You would hear this style of music, and it's still really popular in those areas. There's a term for that. I can't think of what it is. It's a really
Cliff, do you mean Schlager?
Schlager. That's exactly it. Schlager music, and it's folkish. It's folk. It's bands. It's marches. It's stuff with an accordion. And really weepy kind of things. And the Romanians love that stuff.
Just so you know, Cliff.
Yeah.
Ich liebe Schlager.
Schlager.
I actually do like Schlager music. That's why I know what you're talking about.
I don't mind it at all. When I was on that bus going through Bulgaria with a bunch of sweaty Romanian women, they were playing that stuff on the videos, and they were just eating it up. And I'm sitting there kind of laughing because, they're all getting weepy because, some of the songs are real sad, but that's not really huge. And over here, we don't have that reference, it's just not there. And the French have a little of it, but you really hear a lot of it in the Balkans, the Yugoslavs and the Albanians and the Bulgars and the Romanians. They love this style of music, and you hear it all over.
And Poland as well.
Oh yeah, and Poland too. Well, I guess all those little places that Russia had at one time also, you hear it there, but not so much in Russia. But Ukraine and Belarus and I think Lithuania. Really interesting kind of music, but at the same time that was what was going up against the rock and roll, and rock kind of walked all over it.
Cliff, can you talk to us a bit about talk us through what happened that night, that the fateful LSD trip in Germany?
Okay, well that book, the Red Army Faction Blues, it's told from a point of view of a guy named Peter Urbach. He was the provocateur that was giving the bombs and the drugs to the whole group at the Commune Heinz, and he was working with the German Verfassungsschutz office, which was connected to the secret police there. And he was really, really an important character as far as it went, because he was actually leading them into crazier and crazier things. They started off, it was Rainer Langhans. He had Fritz Teufel, and they had Dietrich Kunzelmann. These were kind of some of the key players there. But Langhans was really one of the big focuses of it. He had this bushy hair and the John Lennon glasses, came from a well-dressed, real flashy, real glib fellow. And but they were all, radicals. They'd read their Marx, they read Marcuse, all those people, they were totally Frankfurt School, neo-Marxists. They hated the Russians and the communism that came out of there, and they didn't like Stasi and all that. They were up against them as much as they were the West. So they started off kind of like Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin. They were kind of clowns. They did some goofy things to celebrate, and also street theater kind of stuff, right? It elevated the consciousness. But they did some crazy things. One of them was they did a pudding assassination of Hubert Humphrey. They got arrested for they were trying to make a bomb. They found all this stuff for it, but it didn't work out. But they ended up with pudding, and they took it. Huh. They took it there and it got arrested because they got the word that they were going to try to put a hit on our at the time vice president. So they ended up getting in the papers, and they were called the 11 Little Oswalds. And the commune was originally they believed in the Marxist ideals, sharing and all this, everything in common, right? And so they had runaways, and they had all kinds of people just coming in and staying there. They were also practicing free love at a very early point in that, which would ended up being a thing that fractured the left at the time. In this Andreas Bader and Gudrun Ensslin and Ulrike Meinhof, those three. And other people too. They were very early coming in, and they were in and out and bouncing around. And that kind of coalesced into several different political movements in Germany among the younger radicals. But what had happened is as time went on, especially with the drug use, because like I say, Urbach was providing the drugs. He was bringing in, at first it was hashish, and that was coming in from Turkey. and then it ended up getting into heroin. He was using the term clink, which was probably the street name for it. Yeah. They were also starting to get LSD and STP, which as a young radical drug head, I never did try, but yeah, I was a child of the 70s myself, and yeah, acid was real popular. I used to really like it a lot, and when I was bad, I used to sell it, and so I know a lot of what this guy was talking about, and same with what Green in the book was discussing. So at any rate, what had happened is that these groups started splitting off, and they got into the drugs, and they eventually what happened is that Langhans met Uschi Obermeyer, who was a top model. She was also a percussionist and vocalist with Amandul.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah, you ever heard them?
Oh yeah.
She was part of the original group, and probably just as much to just get her up there shaking the maracas.
Future episode, Brian. Brian, I think a future episode. But it was also said that, like, she was the most beautiful woman in Germany at the time, or in some places I've seen, she's the most beautiful woman in the world. So she'd have been something to have up there on stage in the band, but also in this commune and just attracting all of these people. But she was a fan of Fleetwood Mac, wasn't she, at that era? That's how they...
Fan of a lot of...
Right.
In fact, one of the people she carried on a relationship outside of Longhans was Jimi Hendrix. She had a fling with him for a while.
Yeah.
And that was pretty famous. Top guitar player in the world and one of the most beautiful women anywhere, And she was gorgeous, just drop dead gorgeous. She's still beautiful, even at the age she's at. But she was not very intellectual. Okay, these other guys were, and even Botter, he had actually read, She didn't like to read. In fact, she was really the face of the sexual revolution in Germany. Britain had Twiggy, and we had our women over here who I can't think now. But she was actually the real face of it, and a real high focal point. And that's really what broke up Commune Eins, was the fact that she and Longer Hans and some of the others, their wealth set them apart from the others, and the others were kind of hanging out and looking for money. They had a biker gang that was associated with them, and they wanted a piece of the action with the money, and they didn't get it, and so they trashed the place, and that really kind of ended the whole thing there. When they ended the Commune Eins, they moved to another place. In fact, they moved out of Berlin. Okay, and this is really where the key was, because Berlin was a special set of circumstances, and so where they moved, they went to Munich. And they set up shop over there. They bounced around a little bit first, but Longer Hans found a castle that was out in the middle of nowhere outside of Munich, and this was called the Haifisch Kommune, and that was where the incident with Peter Green happened. And by this point, you had the Baader Meinhof gang actually had gelled somewhat, and it came out of a group called the Tupamaros, which was named after a Latin American rebellious group that they wanted to emulate, and they were basically terrorists. This was a councilman and a fellow named Mahler, who was also kind of in and out. He was Horst Mahler was a lawyer. He was a radical lawyer that represented a lot of these folks, and he got caught up in the radicalism himself. And they started training they went to Jordan, and they trained there. They got kicked out of there, probably drugs and stuff. And they ended up training with the Palestinians, the PLO. And then from there, they came back to Germany after traveling around a bit. I think they went to Cuba for a little bit.
I think the reason they weren't welcome in the Middle East is because they were practicing free love, and the Muslim blokes weren't in for that. They didn't want them. They asked them to keep that and the nudity on the down low, but they refused, I think, and so some of them were booted out and just had to go back to Europe.
Yeah, there was the character of Urbach really makes fun of that. He because. As a narrator, his perspective is really suspect. You really can't trust him, and they shouldn't have trusted him either. And I think that was part of the guy's, the writer's. His name's Ada Wilson, and he's a musician, by the way. It was in a power pop band in England, but he kind of mocks them for that. That they were, all the stupid commies, right? Even though he was saying the same stuff and he was passing out the pamphlets and working with them, even screwing around with a couple of the girls in the group, he's still cynical about them, And one of the things about Longer Hans was that he was becoming bourgeois, and he really was. with him and Obermeyer, what they were doing was they were becoming this trendy leftist kind of hipster kind of thing, and we see this today. I mean, this kind of character is still around big time, and that was them. They were the rich kids that thought they were going to strike a blow against the man, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so there was a good reason why he was cynical of them. In fact, in the story, he was the one that stirred the bikers up by saying, "Well, you deserve some money." And they're like, yeah, we do. And so they tear the place up because they didn't get any. And so at any rate, but that whole moving out and getting into the high-fish commune and this castle, they were talking about art, and art is a revolutionary act. The worker was no longer important, right? The proletariat, wasn't going to rise up. He was too satisfied with the way that things were, and so the revolutionary cutting edge was going to be the artists, right? You've heard this nonsense.
Yeah.
They were saying this stuff, and this is back in 1969 and 70. So these ideas though were also very similar to what the Dead was saying in California.
So do you think that their interest in Green was just that they could capitalize on his popularity, or do you think that as an artist?
Well, according to this Ada Wilson, and like I say, he's not a reliable narrator. Okay, we have to take what he has to say with a grain of salt, because what he thinks or what he says is that when Peter Green was lured away, okay, that there were Urbach was supposedly in the car with them, and he saw, or not with them, but in another car watching them go up. I can't remember which, but
so let's set the stage. So what happens is Fleetwood Mac is touring in Germany. And he meets up with members of the Commune 1 or K1.
Well, it was Ushi and Reiner that came out, and there were two women supposedly with them, and they approached Peter Green and they started talking to him, and they according to the book, they were talking about music. Now, I've listened to some other accounts about this, and some of the guys from Fleetwood Mac say that there was only the two of them that came up, and they talked to him. It was like it was prearranged. And he gets in the car with them, and Danny Kerwin, I believe, goes with them at the same time, and they go out to the castle. They gave the instructions to where they were at for the rest of the band. Now, the book, this Red Army Faction Blues, the band never shows up, or at least he doesn't see them. He shows up with Bader, Ensslin, and Meinhof, and a couple other people, and they're kind of disgusted by what's going on, and they're not being allowed in. They were looking for money too, and they leave him behind, and they take everybody else back, and they were going to come back later. And according to his story there, he goes in. And he meets up with Peter Green and gives him the acid. And that's the story. And he's not playing with anybody else. Now, that's totally unreliable, because the fact is that when the band showed up and the manager showed up, he was there jamming with other people and on kind of a makeshift stage. And they recorded it. And I understand there's a recording of the music that came from that.
Hmm.
And that he, according to Green himself, this was kind of in his mind totally what he wanted to do, and it was totally spontaneous. There was no pre-arranged anything. It was all coming out of the atmosphere and being channeled through his guitar.
Right.
And this was a kind of an ideal thing for him. But I understand this, that they were looking for somebody to present the revolution that they envisioned to the world. They were looking for basically a focal point, almost a savior. And the book does get into this a little bit, that there was this expectation that came to him that was kind of given to him because he was the unique person at the unique time and the unique place.
Yeah.
And so he was, in the book, kind of goes in a direction I don't think that Greene would have actually totally agreed with, that he was Jesus for a time. And this is, like I say, I think from what I understand about Greene himself was that he, at that time, was becoming something of a Christian. He hadn't become one just yet, but he was becoming that. And that he was repudiating the materialist values that the band was starting to display. See, this is where he and Longhans and Uschi Obermeyer really didn't agree, because they were actually thinking, mass media, big star, focal point, it's socially, we can affect change this way. He wasn't seeing it quite like that. He was seeing it more that the spiritual value that came through the music was what was important.
Right. He had a more pure motive, I guess, probably, right?
Yeah, I would say that. I would say that's exactly it. That he really, I think his heart was in the right place. He was just kind of drifting around in the wrong places. But he was looking for something, and they had actually kind of found that something with themselves. They were selling sex, they were selling music, they were selling drugs, they were selling a lifestyle, the sexual revolution, right? The feminism was kind of a byproduct for some of them, but it was really more of a precursor of this mass marketing kind of ideas that we've got today, that's now falling apart, thankfully.
So if I've gathered everything that I know, and based on what you've said, I mean, so I'd like to get to the meaning behind Green Manalishi in a few minutes here, but sure. As far as that incident in Munich was kind of the turning point for Greene, though, right? I mean, as far as
he and Kerwin were never the same after that.
Right,
and they were casualties, actually.
Right. And it seems to be that not necessarily that it was entirely, but it seems to be, it hinges a lot on the drug use, right?
Just to make things a bit clearer here, I want to talk a bit about Greene's time in Germany. During March 1970, Fleetwood Mac was touring Germany when Peter Greene met up with members of Commune 1, that's Commune 1 or K1. While he was with them, he took LSD, and from this event, things changed in a major way for both him and Fleetwood Mac. Fleetwood Mac managers said that this was a crucial point in the decline of Greene's mental health. It was shortly after this that Greene left Fleetwood Mac. Apparently, he had met Uschi Obermeyer and Rainer Langhans and was invited to hang out with them at their Haiflischer commune. When he didn't return to the band, other members of Fleetwood Mac went to fetch him. Apparently, he was having a wonderful time jamming with the commune members and doing drugs. In later times, Greene said of the event, quote, "I had a good play there. It was great. Someone recorded it. They gave me a tape. There were people playing along, a few of us just fooling around, and it was great," unquote. He told Jeremy Spencer at the time, quote, "That's the most spiritual music I've ever recorded in my life," unquote. Now, Jeremy Spencer was another member of Fleetwood Mac at the time. So, subsequently, after a final appearance with Fleetwood Mac in May 1970, Greene left the band. And as I mentioned earlier, this was a major turning point for Greene as far as playing music and his mental health are concerned, as he was later diagnosed with schizophrenia and spent time in psychiatric hospitals and even undergoing electroconvulsive therapy. Alright, so I just wanted to throw that in there to make it clear what we're talking about here. Okay, now before we get back to the show, let me remind you that all previous episodes of Philosopher Rock are available on our YouTube channel, so please find us on YouTube and remember to like and subscribe. Alternatively, you can go to our website, likeflintradio, that's www.likeflintradio.com, likeflintradio.com, www.likeflintradio.com, and there you can find all our previous shows and maybe some other things that might be of interest to you. If you want to contact us, you can email us at philosopherrock@gmail.com. That's philosopherrock@gmail.com. Also, please bear in mind that unless otherwise stated, the opinions expressed in this show are those of the hosts and their guest. Okay, that's enough from me. Now, let's get back to the show.
There was a program, and this guy, he had to yank it because there was some. I think Fleetwood Mac actually went after him because of some of the music that he put on there. But it wasn't Greene himself. But he was talking about different drug casualties, especially with acid, because there were so many of them in the 60s and 70s that just lost it because of that. But it wasn't so much the drug itself by itself. There was a mental state that he was in, and was probably partly physical at least, that
Right.
that inclined him towards perhaps having mental problems.
And that's exactly where I want to pinpoint, because those particular drugs, the psychedelic psychotropic drugs, do, I believe, from my own experience, and you'd probably vouch for this as well, but they do open something up in the human to a more spiritual experience that can be co-opted by people who have an agenda that's nefarious.
Oh yeah.
And
well, what happens is that your filters are removed.
Right, exactly.
Our perception, we actually know more than what we see and perceive consciously.
Right.
And if you remove that filter, you'll notice things that you didn't notice.
Right.
And you'll experience things in your mind and in your emotions that you weren't aware of, but they were there.
Exactly. And that can take its toll on the human psyche, especially if you've already got issues of confusion, possibly, or let's say, and you're kind of on the fence about where you're going to go spiritually, and then you get pushed or tipped by, the agenda of, like I said, nefarious parties, sure. and also the spiritual element that you come in contact with, which, I mean, in my experience, was actually what I would say was a demon. So you get in spiritual information there as well, like transcendently, and then that's where I think Greene started to lose his mental faculties as far as drifting into schizophrenia.
I think that's pretty right.
We know that shortly after this, isn't it, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And the thing I was going to say about this is that, especially if people have a predisposition to mental illness, the use of heavy drugs, especially regular, is, in my opinion, something that, could trip you over into that if you had that predisposition. Sure. And the other thing, though, about LSD that I'm just learning, because I've never had an experience with it, but it actually replicates the early stages of psychosis. So it can send you,
sure.
Send you around the bend.
Well, that's about right.
And it can make you crazy. And I'm sure it has affected a lot of people that way that were predisposed to that. But also, sure. I would argue, and just my opinion, that excessive use and constant use and all that, you're just sort of asking for trouble as far as that goes. That leads us to this. I do want to talk about one of Fleetwood Mac's songs, and it's Pete Greene written, the Greene Manalishi, because there are a couple of different points of views about this song, the Greene Manalishi, with the two-pronged crown, right?
Yeah.
And now I come across this song initially through Judas Priest, because I was in almost a Judas Priest cover band. We played so many Judas Priest songs we could have been. And I think you have too, Brian, right?
Yeah. We were specifically a Judas Priest cover band, yeah. So.
Yeah, you were specific, and we paid about a third. But anyway, Brian, I'm going to ask you to give us your opinion, what you found out about the Green Manalishi. So this is the Fleetwood Mac tune, and as far as I know, it was the last song that Peter Green recorded with Fleetwood Mac. Take us through it, Brian, and then Cliff and I will jump in after you give us the background.
Yeah, sure. So it's an interesting song to start with because it's got a different kind of feel than what I would say Fleetwood Mac was kind of doing at the time anyway. It's got like a heavier, more doomy, foreboding kind of type of riff, something akin to like Smoke on the Water or something like that, but by Deep Purple. But so Green himself has at least, he waffles on everything that he talks about in general, but one of the things that he said, at least at one point, was that the lyrics were about money. And so I can see that, given that he had become a person who basically wanted to eschew all like wealth, or at least exorbitant wealth. But the interesting thing about it is, I mean, I guess lyrically we could read in that it's about money. But there's a couple of things in the song, lyrically, like imagery that he brings up in the song that remind me of something a little more dark. Like, okay, he's talking about the full moon, darkness cooks, come creeping around, make me do things I don't want to do. And he, the idea of the Manalishi with the two-pronged crown. So I tried to find out what the word Manalishi even meant, but it sounds...
Yeah. It's Sanskrit.
Yeah. Oh, is it? Okay.
Great serpent.
Okay. Well, there you go. And the two-pronged crown thing. So, that gives like the imagery of like the horned kind of demonic, typical demon or devil imagery that we think of in today's, not even just today, but typically through history. But when one of my experiences, and I don't know how relevant this is going to be to anything we're talking about, but I just figure I'll share it. One of my experiences, this was before I was really even paying attention to Fleetwood Mac in general, but specifically Pete Green or the song, because I don't know that I even heard this song until after this experience. But anyway, one of the times when I had used quite a bit of LSD in one evening, I had an encounter with what I would consider probably it had to have been a spiritual being, that sort of fit the description of this Green Manalishi with the two-pronged crown. I know it's weird and it's going to sound crazy to people who've never used drugs, especially psychedelic drugs, but this is a common theme in people who use psychedelic drugs, is these types of interactions with these types of spiritual beings. They see these serpent type beings and communicate with them and everything like that. And in this particular instance that I experienced, there was this serpent type being that was green. And the weird thing is too, this was way before The Matrix came out, the movie The Matrix, which has a bunch of occultish overtones to it anyway. But that movie has a sort of green tint to it, and there a lot when he's using the computer at the beginning, you got that black screen, and he's typing, and there's like green type going on, the little code that's popping up or whatever. That's exactly what, in my experience, that's exactly what how this being manifests. It was like complete blackness against a complete black background, like dense, dead black, with this like green serpent horned being. And the messages that this being gave me were pretty incredible. I still remember it very vividly. But so when I hear, Green and talking about these lyrics, and when I hear, that the Manalishi Sanskrit thing has to do with like serpent, the idea of a serpent, it just takes me back to that, and tie it together with the fact that he's using psychedelic drugs, and you've got them coming out of Nazi Germany or former Nazi Germany, which is all based in the occult, and then Green himself having been in bands like I can't think of their name now. The guy that he was in the band with, a famous guy that Clapton and everybody came through. We just talked about.
Mayall?
Yeah, John Mayall. I mean, they had a song, I'm your witch doctor. So there's a lot of like, especially at that time in Britain too, well, generally in Britain, it seems like, paganism and occultism was kind of like a thing, especially through like bands like Led Zeppelin and all that stuff. So all these things kind of have like a common touch point, it seems like, all these themes. And so when Green says that Green Manalishi, we're sort of obliged to take his word. He wrote the song. But I think, maybe it is about money, but I think there's something else going on in there too. Just the lyrics busting in on all my dreams, making me see things I don't want to see. It's almost like he's talking about something else,
Well, the thing about lyrics is that they often are like three-dimensional.
Yes, at least three-dimensional, yeah.
Yeah, and there's other places it can go, dream states and stuff. But the idea of it being money, I find it valid. But I also look at what you're talking about too. That there's this kind of an entity that's totally not exactly like Cass. And not only that, he's British. British money isn't green.
Good point.
So there's something else going on here. I had to look it up when I was playing it. I was in a band in Macomb. There were a bunch of Chicago boys, and actually they carried on after I left. But we were doing that there, and we were doing all kinds of metal, kind of a glam metal at the time. And but we did a lot of priests, and I did a lot of priests in different groups I was in over the years too. So it's like I'm singing this song, so it's like I want to know what's in it. What's this about? And I hunted it down, and I figured out it was Sanskrit, and Lishi is serpent, and mana is a prefix that's used to show something great, kind of like Maharishi. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's comparable as a prefix. And so what you have is two elements that come together to make one word. The great serpent with the two-pronged crown, two horns, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And I understood that he rather saw that as his guitar. I forget where I read that. But that was quite a while back. I had a lot of friends that were really into, they were into a lot of other things too, but they were really into the stuff he was doing in the late 70s and early 80s.
Well, that's right. This is why I said there's several opinions on this, right? Because we've already
there are.
But we've come up with a couple, because didn't he say also it was a barking dog talking to him?
Yeah.
a green barking dog.
There was a whole set of stuff, and it's like he was saying, he changes his story. Reality is not bendable, but our perception of it is.
No, that's a good point. Yeah.
And the book goes into that, and with an unreliable narrator, that becomes a really important idea. The guy did a great job. Ada Wilson did a really good job if you know what you're getting into. If you don't, I think it'd probably be a little bit harder reading. But the thing is that he may have changed his ideas about it as his mind about it changed.
Yeah, good point.
And so you would hear something one time, but you hear something else another time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it would develop. Sometimes he would just kind of glitch and maybe go back to the original story.
I wonder if what we deem as mental illness is really kind of almost an outworking of the worldview that he actually wanted to live, because he wanted to be spontaneous and
right.
be part of this kind of unfettered mindset. And think about the fact that if you change your story and your story is fluid and you just say whatever you want to say, he's almost living out the mindset that he wanted to achieve, which that just dawned on me right now. But I mean, because things like, because at one point he said he didn't like using minor chords, but one of his biggest hits is in F sharp minor, and it's like, and when Kirk Hammett, I mean, I don't want to jump ahead too far, but when Kirk Hammett ended up buying his guitar, Kirk Hammett from Metallica, he participated in a Pete Green tribute album, and so he took the guitar Greeny and went to Peter Green's house, I guess, or wherever he met him, and he played the song for him. And first of all, Peter Green said, "That's not my guitar," and Kirk Hammett was kind of just taken aback, like, "What do you?" That was the first thing he said to him, and he's like, "This is your guitar." And his buddy said, Pete Green's buddy was kind of there as almost like an interpreter. He said, he thinks it's not his guitar because it doesn't have the red tint that it used to, that had faded or whatever. And so anyway, I guess Hammett played the song for him, and right when he was finished, Peter Green turned to his friend that was there and said, "What's the weather going to be like this week?" He didn't even comment on the song that had just been played to him, which was, and I guess his friend had said, he does this all the time. He did like your playing of it because I could tell he was tapping his foot the entire time, and somehow that was a sign that, he liked it. But I'm starting to wonder throughout this interview if the guy wasn't as, mentally incapable or damaged as we might think. Maybe he was living out some of what he wanted to see happen. You know what I mean?
Right. But that's a valid thing. At the point that he wanted this spontaneity and the changeability was part of his character, but it was also part of his philosophy, his outlook.
Right.
And did that contribute to his mental illness, or vice versa? Did the mental illness contribute to that? How much of it was drugs? How much of it was the philosophy that was going on at the time? How much of it did he get from Owsley? Owsley was talking things like this. And some of the Dead. Some of the guys in the Dead still did. Garcia did right up until the day he died.
Regardless of whether or not Green was actually trying to live out his philosophy or his personal philosophy of a sort of improvised reality or whatever, it is interesting to mention. I think it would be important for us to realize that to live an unhinged and unfettered sort of existence is really only going to complicate things and make them more chaotic. I mean, imagine if everybody did this, right? And I think what people don't want to realize, that they think they realize it, but they don't want to give assent to it, is the idea that rules and boundaries actually produce more freedom. Now, some rules are unnecessary or maybe even overbearing, but rules and boundaries are really there to protect us, to give us more freedom.
So you have all this all coming together, and plus the improvisation of music. I've always liked to improvise. I found that I could do that. I was always able to sometimes come up with lyrics while I was singing along with the band and just kind of channeling it. And where does it come from? I mean, this is always a good question. We always kind of wonder where does that come from?
Right, exactly. It's non-physical. It's non-physical to start with, so we've already got you can rule out certain worldviews there. But yeah, I mean, it's there's some, it's manifesting from somewhere,
Even as a teacher, I'm stream of consciousness.
Right.
So I do understand the point of view here, and there's a part of me that agrees with it, but I'm also leery of it. Mm-hmm. Because there are sometimes things that you just kind of blurt out that, it's like, why did I do that?
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that,
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of reality. Is this the psychosis, or is inspiration a form of madness? I wouldn't even go to that extreme.
I don't want to completely discount the idea that he had some sort of mental issues, because I mean, Bob Welsh, who took Green's place, he actually in an interview had mentioned that he had met Green. He met Green, let's say on a Monday, I think, whatever day it was. He said, and then he noticed that Green had a piece of cheese in his hair, and
that's hilarious.
He said that 5 days later he still had that piece of cheese in his hair. So the guy wasn't like taking care of himself or that kind of thing, which is a classic sign of you abandon, your own like well-being. That's a classic sign of mental illness, but
taking the dirty hippie to a new level.
Just thinking outside of the box, have you considered that he might have had a pet mouse in his hair?
That hadn't occurred to me, but
yeah, I listened to the same interview. It's hilarious.
So, lads, I want to move on to another interesting aspect about Peter Green, and it's one that I find really interesting, and it's his guitar, Greeny, the guitar. Now, I'll just quickly run through it and let you guys comment, but he had a 59 Les Paul, and he bought it during his Blues Breaker days when he was Miles Blues Breakers. And so say around about 1966, and we bought it secondhand, and it was $300. And there was something strange and odd about this guitar. But this guitar has been called, its nickname is Greeny, or Moore's Greeny, or Greeny's Moore, or whatever it is, but Greeny's guitar. And it has been through the hands of three fantastic guitar players, one of my favourite of all times. It ended up with Gary Moore. But can we talk about that now, Brian? Have you got a couple of comments on that guitar? And can you tell us what was actually wrong with it and why it sounded like it did?
Well, my knowledge of it is as follows. So a lot of people were taken with the tone and how he achieved that tone. So one of the speculations was the idea that the pickups had been turned out of phase. So basically what that means is that if you've got two pickups that have the same polarity, and then you turn one of them and switch the polarity, then that'll give you an out of phase. It has to do with wave signs and and electronics and things like that. But it gives the guitar a certain quack, kind of almost like a vocal quality to the notes. I've actually done that on one of my guitars intentionally, because people do it intentionally sometimes if they want that sound. But so I gather that at one point Green, so he'd waffle on this as well. Like he said, that never did happen. That wasn't the case. But apparently they've got video footage of a performance where one of the pickups was removed. So it's not true that the pickup was never removed. But then come to find out that there was a person, they apparently know the luthier or guitar person who actually said he's the one who did the work on the guitar to rewind the pickup in the different configuration to give it the out of phase. So right. I think now, as far as any kind of like supernatural kind of qualities to the guitar, I'm unaware of any of that, but the sound that it had at least had something to do with the fact that it was wired in that fashion or whatever to give it that sound. So that's pretty much the extent of my knowledge on the guitar, which is interesting.
What I heard was that it was from the factory, because others had said that theirs were reversed from the factory. Other guitars had come out from the same era, and they looked at them and they said, no, this is done at the factory. And right. By the way, I like the interesting point that you made, the quack sound, Brian. I was wondering if you would demonstrate that for us. Is it sort of quack, quack, or is it quack, quack, quack? Or I'm just trying to imagine it in my head here. But I know that he handed that to Gary Moore. Was he some sort of kind of a mentor to Gary Moore? Is that right?
Yeah. I believe so, yeah. And I'm not trying to, just so you know, I'm not trying to duck your comment on the quack thing.
Oh, I like it. Love it. We're coming to the end of the show, and it's all coming out now. We're cutting loose here with the crazy jokes. No, but he passed it on to Gary Moore, who had it, was it for 25 years and recorded a number of albums with it. And like I say, Gary Moore, one of my favourite guitarists. He even had he recorded a complete album called Blues for Greeny, based on Peter Green's songs. So towards the other end of his career, Gary Moore, went completely blues, in his recordings, his studio recordings. Uh-huh. And then, so would one of you guys want to talk us through what happened to the guitar after Gary Moore?
I also want to let you know, I just put on WhatsApp the article from a guy named Joel Danzig. He was the luthier that found that, and it's a good article. And he wrote it in 2011, and he also talks about, you know, that even with Peter Green's guitar, that Gary Moore still sounded like Gary Moore.
Right. That's good.
But yeah, the thing was is he lent it to him, and then he offered to sell it to him, which is kind of strange. He may have some accounts are that he gave it to him to keep, and then he decided, hey, can you spare a little bit of money? Because, you know, he was so into giving away his money, he didn't have any. Which I find pretty funny by itself. But more, he played for a long time, but when he sold it, he was kind of in a bad financial situation. Otherwise, he would have kept it. So it wasn't exactly a happy thing to do, but he needed the money, and I think he got like $1 million for it.
Wow.
It was a lot of money.
It seems like this guitar changes hands based on somebody's like poor financial state, because I think Kirk Hammett said he picked it up from whoever he bought it from because he was in the right place at the right time, somebody that was desperate for some cash. So
when you think about the Green God, the green guitar, the green Manalishi, and all this green, these layers of green, that to some extent that guitar was the agency of the Manalishi, and that when he gave it away, he was actually trying to change his life. And so it's kind of interesting, because I know that he was developing into kind of a Christian kind of thinking. I don't know that he ever really truly became a Christian, but his ideas were definitely reflecting a Christian type of philosophy. And that may have been as much his brother's influence, because he was the one that wrote the songs for him in the late 70s and early 80s. So, you know, where does one start and the other begin? Right?
Right.
But by the same token, there's no doubt that he was in a certain position that couldn't maintain itself. This wasn't sustainable. So when he gave that guitar away, it was a total change of his life. And the guitar was magical, right? I mean, that's what they called it. It was a magic guitar. So he passed the magic on to Moore.
Right, and that's now been passed on to
Kirk Hammett.
Right, from Metallica, right?
But,
yeah.
Now, the first person I think that got it after Moore was a guy that had a music store.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And he put it on display, and then I guess he needed money. He sold it off to a collector, and it passed through 2 or 3 collectors before Hammett got it.
Was the figure $2 million?
It was like 2.1, yeah.
I would say Kirk Hammett denied that was. I think I don't know. I thought the last thing that I saw was that he had said that wasn't quite that much money.
Right.
But that was I don't know how it became reported that was what he paid for it, but.
Yeah, there were a lot of articles that said that was the amount. In fact, I think it was on eBay.
Oh, really?
If I'm not mistaken. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it was eBay or through something. It was a big deal when he bought it. And they were all reporting 2.1 million. And yeah, and he's walked that back. Again, we've got this layer of reality and perception. that there's this elusive quality, right?
Right.
Which is true. I guess it depends on who's telling the story and when they're telling it.
Yeah.
So even with the guitar and all that, I mean, in fact, this Red Army Faction Blues, you have these repeating ideas, these repeating actually phrases and stuff. He sometimes it's like a litany that you might hear in a Catholic church, where they repeat parts over and over and over and build on them. And he does that with the book. The book is really interestingly done. I mean, he understands three-dimensional thinking really well, and I really appreciate that. But at the same time, like I say, it can be really confusing, I think, for somebody that doesn't know what they're getting into. But that's still the idea, this changeability of the reality. But even with this consistent metonymy, where you have this deep structure of images and ideas that repeat themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and they progress the story. Really fascinating how that's working out in real life.
Yeah.
All right, guys. I think we'll start to wind up there. Thank you both for your time. Before I let you go, I want to ask you both. I'll start with you, Brian. What is on your turntable this week, Brian? What have you been listening to mostly this week?
Well, I happily got my 50th anniversary copy of Budgie's second album, Squawk, on picture disc, which bought directly from Budgie themselves. One Burke Shelley, which is really cool, and got an autographed card that came with it. Since it's a picture disc, they didn't want to write on the record itself. There's no outer sleeve for the picture disc, so
cool.
you got a card with it that had, which I was blown away because not only did Burke Shelley sign it, but he had got Tony Borge or Borge or however you pronounce his name, Tony Borge, the guitar player that was with them until the Impeccable album, but he signed it. And original drummer Steve Williams also signed it, which is really super cool. So I was pretty stoked to get that, and I've been playing that one around here, and it sounds good for a picture disc. Sometimes the quality can be questionable as far as the noise of the vinyl itself, but it sounds really good, and I've been rocking that one. I'm telling you what, Budgie, you guys who know Budgie, which you do, but
oh yeah,
I mean, the heavy that they were heavy, man, and like my speakers, like I gotta turn the bass frequencies down a little bit so I don't blow my speakers with that one. But yeah, good British prog, hard, heavy, kind of Sabbathy type stuff. For those who don't know, I always have a hard time. I always have a hard time describing Budgie. I don't mean to get too far off track here, but when I was went to see Yes, so I figured I'd wear a Roger Dean shirt, and Dean had done some of the album covers for he did at least Never Turn Your Back on a Friend, which is a Budgie album. So I had worn that shirt to a Yes concert because I figured Yes fans will appreciate Roger Dean art. So I was standing in line to get my tickets from Will Call, and this guy turned to me and he says, "Budgie, who's Budgie?" And I said, "Well, they're hard to describe, I said, I kind of imagine a mix of early Black Sabbath with maybe Geddy Lee from Rush singing." And he said, "That sounds terrible." I said, well, maybe I didn't do them justice in my comparison there, but so yeah, I mean, they're great band, totally underrated, but tons of material out there for people to check out. So that's what I'm listening to, is Squawk by Budgie. Cliff, what do you got what's been on your turntable?
I don't really have a turntable. In my car, I play CDs once in a while. The one that's sitting in the CD player right now is a B.B. King at Folsom Prison. It's a really sweet album. That's the one I've been listening to off and on lately. I need to put more music in my car. Yeah, that's pretty much what I've listened to. I before that, I was kind of on a kick with Art Garfunkel, and it was like a greatest hits, which was good stuff. I mean, Bridge Over Troubled Water's on there, but that one that All I Know, which is just the song that just still to this day just knocks my socks off.
Cool, Cliff. What's been on your turntable, Garth? What you been listening to?
Well, I've been listening to a couple of things, but one thing I wanted to tell you that I received in the mail a 50th anniversary picture disc of Budgie, their very first album titled Budgie, and it came with a card that had autographed by all three members. I didn't order this disc. I wasn't expecting this disc. And it's a lovely birthday present from my co-host Brian there. And I can tell you, I've had it for 4 or 5 days, and I'm still buzzing because, it's a very special. I love Budgie, and I have since I was, 13 or 14, and that's not that long ago. So I'm a big Budgie fan, and Brian and I found each other being Budgie fans sort of a few years ago. One of the things we clicked first, we're both Budgie fans. But what I've been listening to is another prog rock band from the British Isles, hailing from Scotland, called Beggars Opera. Now, Beggars Opera, brilliant Scottish prog rock band, operational from around 69 to 1976. They got a number of good albums. So the last few days, my wife and I have been listening to each and every album of theirs. And they contain all the good elements of good prog rock, good organ, good guitar work, interesting vocals, interesting lyrics and themes. Very relaxing to listen to. That doesn't mean to say you play it quietly. You can play it loud, but I just find Beggars Opera quite relaxing. They also make use of the mellotron instrument, which has always fascinated me. Since I was about 14, the mellotron has been one of those instruments that's fascinated me, and a number of prog rock bands, from back in the day, they made use of the mellotron.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things about these guys is that they also do a couple of super interesting covers that you go, when I tell you what they are, you're going to go, what? They do this cover of MacArthur Park. And I've got to tell you, that's a very long song, and it's very complex, and it's one of those songs that was a hit for Richard Harris way back in the day, and they didn't think it was going to be a hit because it's such a long song. But anyway, these guys do a really great cover of that, but they also do Classical Gas. Do you guys remember the...
Oh, that's cool.
Oh, it's just a couple of covers that they throw in a couple of albums. So they're really interesting. And what might be of interest to some people who are going, who are these guys? Beggars Opera? Well, the guitarist, Ricky Gardner, he went on to play on David Bowie's Low album, and he also played on Iggy Pop's Lust for Life disc. But he also co-wrote The Passenger, the tune The Passenger, one of my favourite Iggy Pop songs.
Mm-hmm.
And that features on the Lust for Life album. And as far as I'm aware, this tune is about Iggy Pop's time in Berlin with David Bowie, right? And it's loosely based on a poem by none other than Jim Morrison. So it's funny how so many of these things tie in nicely, isn't it? Since our last show here on Philosopher Rock was about Jim Morrison and the Doors, and then you've got that Iggy Pop, David Bowie connection there with this guy from Beggars Opera. So get onto Spotify, get onto YouTube, and give them a whirl if you like the typical sounding British era prog rock. These guys, Scottish, love the Scots, got to give them their due there. So Beggars Opera is what's been on my mind. So last thoughts. I'll throw it to you, Cliff, for your last thoughts before we say goodbye to you, and then you, Brian.
I was going to say, Iggy Pop, mentioning him, he did an album with Goran Bregovic, yeah. And he's a Balkan artist that, we were talking about Schlager, right? And he was Yugoslav, and he in Turkey, he's one of the biggest things ever. So this album he did with Iggy was partly the soundtrack to one of Johnny Depp's movies. He does like Schlager. I mean, it's a really bizarre style of music, and they love him in Turkey because they do similar music of their own.
Schlager ist mein Nummer eins.
Nummer eins. Yeah, he worked with Iggy, and it was part of the soundtrack to one of the movies. Arizona Dream is what it's called. And really bizarre movie. Good movie, though. I enjoyed it a lot. It had Faye Dunaway in it.
Okay. I don't know it.
And,
yeah.
Oh, it's totally tripped out. They have literally flying fish.
Oh, wow.
In the movie, and the death car is this machine that they're messing around with. But yeah, there's Goran Bregovic, and the movie is in the Arizona Dream. It was in the early 90s.
Alrighty, well, we'll leave it there, lads. Cliff, I just want to say thanks very much for coming on the show and giving us your time. Really appreciated it. And
my pleasure.
Yeah, well, thank you. Brian?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me, as always, as a co-host. And thanks, Cliff, for coming on with your obvious wealth of knowledge. I appreciate your input on this topic today.
Well, thanks for having me.